Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on the Political Current podcast. Today we are speaking with a group of activists whose work has largely been ignored in media outlets. Dayan for Humanity is a grassroots network based in the Washington, D.C. area, and they're best known for breaking the record for the longest running encampment for Gaza in U.S. history in front of former Secretary of State Antony Blinken's home. Today we are speaking with three of its members. Atefeh Rokhvand is a career educator and the founder of Teachers Against Genocide. Hazami Barmada is a social entrepreneur and humanitarian with over 20 years of experience organizing social impact programs. And Sumer Mobarak is a Palestinian activist who is best known for advocating for Palestine and other human rights issues. So to get right into it, Atefeh, I know you are the founder of Teachers Against Genocide. Can you start us off with what this group is, what was the inspiration behind it, and how did it get started?
Thank you for having us. I started Teachers Against Genocide just out of sheer necessity and as a direct response to the atrocities that I was witnessing, we were all witnessing on October 7th and afterwards. I was trying to find my footing in the beginning and trying to figure out what daily actions I could do to raise awareness and advocate for Palestinian human rights. And so, one of the things that I initially started doing was to go to Congress a few times a week and speak with congressional staffers.
Right.
I'd usually just introduce myself as an individual and I would mention that I'm a teacher. One, because that is what I did for most of my life. And
Right.
two, because teachers are usually known for being voices of reason and empathy and love and, critical thinking. So that's kind of how it came about.
Right. That's amazing. And Hazami, to kind of shift over to your perspective as well, this is a subject that the mainstream has obviously not covered. And this really struck me, especially when I found out that your team actually made a record for the longest running encampment for Gaza in history. And that is a huge deal. Usually, if we think about, any of the longest or the most significant events that happen around us, media is right on it to be like, this is something new that's happening, this is important, and draw attention to it. Now, this in specific has long been ignored, and you have actually gotten lots of hostility for the work that you have been doing. Can you tell us more about the Kibbutz Blinken project, why you chose this specific kind of mode of activism, and what you hope to accomplish with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, sustained, persistent, persevered activism for Palestine is not something that unfortunately we've seen covered positively by mainstream media. I personally left a pretty great career to become a full time activist, which activism has always been part of my ethos. It's been part of the work I do. I do social impact strategy and human rights. And so putting my boots on the ground, showing up in the spaces that need to see a visual representation of the manifestation of our anger, our frustration, our utter disgust at the lack of policies that address the human rights aspirations that we all talk about but don't live by, especially as a country. And so I decided to just, not do things from behind the boardroom table or, from within the State Department. I tell people the last trip I took to Palestine was funded by the US government, was funded by the US State Department. I was there as part of a speakers bureau
Interesting.
of the US government. And so being
Right.
in front of the home of the Secretary of State was very intentional for me because I wanted to bring, the public policy experience that I had to say it doesn't work when we are politicking behind closed doors. It has never worked for the Palestinian cause,
Right.
and our protest was not only the longest sustained protest for Palestine. It was longer than even if you look at Occupy Wall Street. I mean, their encampments lasted for less than we did. We were out there for 6 months in front of Blinken's home and 6 months in front of the embassy of apartheid Israel.
Right.
And that was very important. It was also the longest running protest, I think, against a US Secretary of State in the history of the United States that was consistent by the same group. And all these things, I think, made people extremely uncomfortable. I think they challenged the perspective of also who's an activist. We were a bunch of educated PhD, doctors, teachers, engineers,
Right.
scientists, grandmothers, mothers. I mean, we were not the typical face of a protester. And I think
Absolutely.
just that disruption, just people didn't know how to deal with it.
Right. And you mentioned, just to follow up before I move on to Summer, you mentioned that you realized with your career that that would not be the meaningful way to make change, and that you switched over gears to activism. One of the criticisms that we often hear about activists and the work that they do is, we have had so much activism going on with relation to the Palestine issue for the past year as well as before. And many say technically it's not accomplishing anything because the government will continue its track, especially when it comes to the funding of Israel as a serious foreign policy issue that the US has been so consistent with. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Look, I'm a student of policy. I studied at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Prior to that, I worked at the United Nations. I've done the politics, and I've worked with the
Right.
institutions that are the back end of that. And I will say with clarity and with confidence that activism is not a standalone entity. Activism is a form of showing up. We also do need writers, we need thinkers, we need media personalities, we need
Right.
lawyers, we need accountants, we need all the people that create the infrastructure to sustain the advocacy for human rights. So I think like saying that activism is kind of this thing or it's a career is something that I want to bust wide open. It is not. It's simply a way of showing up to represent a visual representation of the outrage felt by failed policy, and also not only shining a sustained light, but highlighting to people that try to just bury these issues and ignore them that we're here to stay, we're loud, we're unapologetic, and we will continue to be a thorn in your side because change is uncomfortable. Change is not
Absolutely.
something and power is not something that is just relinquished, right? It is demanded and it is taken. And you do that in big part by showing that you're not afraid, that you're willing to be relentless, and that you're willing to constantly keep a light on an issue that the media and everyone around us is trying to bury. And so I think the last thing I would say on that, on the topic of activism, there are so many forms of activism for Palestine that have been going on for decades. You have
Right.
thought leaders, you have writers, you have intellectuals, you have artists, you have muralists, you have creative content creators, and this is all part of the fight. And everyone shows up in the way that they can with the talent they have. And it's a collective sustained movement that's going to create and liberate Palestine and create kind of a pathway to freedom for Palestinians. And I think it just requires more people to let go of the fear of showing up with their entire selves.
Absolutely. And kind of to shift gears as well, Summer, I know you are Palestinian yourself, and I didn't know this, but when you were in Palestine, you were arrested at 15 years old. Can you also tell us a little bit about that experience and how it informed your activism today?
I had lived there for 2 years, with my mom and my younger sister in ninth and 10th grade, and, I mean, I've always had a love for Palestine. We would go there every year. It's where my parents are from,
Right.
and, but that during that time when I lived there, it was during the first Intifada, and the, IOF were directly in, the West Bank, in Ramallah, where I lived, and we would see them constantly. You would know every single day that, a certain time, there would be demonstrations and reactions from the, soldiers, and
Right.
I would go to school, walk every day to and from school, and my mother was worried and concerned because we don't have, citizenship, as you would call it, Hawiyya in Arabic, for, Palestine, because I was born here in America and my mom left before the war, so she did
Right.
not get a chance to get one. So we were essentially living there, they would say, illegally, and she was always concerned about the fact if I were to go out to a demonstration or, even I used to love to be artistic and draw a lot of, political things that would be in our home, and she would wanna kill me for it because she was afraid that the soldiers would come in, one day because they would always go to homes and just break in and
Right.
arrest people. So, I, one day when my mom was in the States, I decided I wanted to go and be like the rest of the kids that were there, and I, went to a
And get yourself in
demonstration.
trouble.
Yeah, I get myself in trouble. Went to a demonstration, and right away, as soon as the tires were lit and the rocks were thrown, they came around as quickly as possible, and we tried to hide in a building. They knew where we were and refused to let us, out. And they finally came up actually and told us that we had to come down. And at that time, during the Intifada, they had somewhat a little more respect for women, that they wouldn't touch a woman. They would bring female soldiers to arrest the women.
Right.
Um, and now they don't care. But anyway, essentially, I was taken and put there for, it wasn't even a whole day. But what I heard and saw from these soldiers were so vile and disgusting. And because they knew that I had come from America, the way I was dressed, the way I looked, they made all kinds of threats, that they,
Wow.
how they were going to find me, and how that I probably had money since I came from the United States. It was very ugly. And since then, I did not think twice about the fact that I needed to keep opening my mouth, which, if a lot of people know me, I have a big mouth and I don't know how to stay quiet. So it was just a little bit of an eye opener, although, it was nothing compared to what people have been going through and what people are going through now and the genocide. But it was a big eye opener to see that this is how I was treated, and that I could just at any moment be arrested by them.
Right.
Me thinking, oh, I have an American citizenship, nothing's going to happen to me. And that was not the case.
Right. And that's interesting. And I want to follow up with that. As a Palestinian, you also have the perspective of seeing what's happening there. So now we know that Trump is in office, and we're already seeing that he has plans to take over Gaza, to clear out the Palestinians, even send them to Jordan and Egypt, as he's, boldly claiming. As an activist and as someone who has been there and seen everything going on, especially with the ties you have with your family, where do you see this going? Do you think that the voices of dissent like yourself and your team in this country will ever be strong enough to prevent something like this from happening?
I think so. I have to have that kind of perspective and hope, because if I don't, then what is all this for? Um, if you know Palestinian and people who live there and seen what the genocide has put them through, and they went right back to their homes, even though they were demolished, nothing will stop them from staying in their homes. Nothing will stop them from rebuilding, and no matter how long it takes. And no matter what Trump says, you will have the Palestinians and pro-Palestinians that will think this is a crazy idea. It's not going to happen. We will do everything in our power to not let it happen.
Absolutely. And speaking about, crazy ideas, I know a lot of people would target activists and say what you are doing is way too much, is too extreme. And one of those examples that are often brought up in this conversation are hunger strikes. Now, I know Atefeh and Hazami, you have both gone on a hunger strike. Can either of you explain a little bit about what informed that decision? Why did you choose to do that? And what message did you want to send by doing so?
So we kind of approached it a bit differently. But I mean, I did a hunger strike in the countdown to Biden's last days in office and his administration's last days in office. There was a tangible end goal in sight for me, which was the 20th of January. I started the beginning of December. And the idea was that it would create a visual representation that the staff of the State Department and the White House had to physically walk by, going in and out of their jobs, to see what the toll of starvation is on a human body. We know that starvation impacts children in very, very significant ways, more so than adults, because their bodies are much smaller.
Right.
I ended up on day 19 of my hunger strike, unfortunately, hospitalized because of something called refeeding syndrome and water intoxication. So I was on a hunger strike that was 0 calories, and I was consuming water, and was not great at taking any vitamins or supplements because they had so many additives, and it was really hard to find ones that didn't have calories and didn't have a bunch of unnecessary stuff.
Right.
But on day 19 of my hunger strike, I was, coerced by some people. Atefeh is one of the people who tried to encourage me to take at least some type of supplement, and I introduced in order to sustain myself, right? So for the long run, to get to January 20th. And I,
Right.
unfortunately, my body went into shock, and it was extremely scary and extremely terrifying to endure. I have never felt that way in my life. I was, shaking. I was throwing up. Every part of my body was aching. I ended up very yellow to the point that one of the doctors at the emergency room thought I had jaundice. I was like flushed. I couldn't walk. I couldn't speak. I didn't know that it impacted your brain,
Well,
the impacts of deficiency of vitamin B on your brain and thiamine, and also your heart. So I had an irregular heartbeat, and my heart was not working well. And the reason I bring this up is I think there's a lot of times activists will do modified hunger strikes and not be very open about what they are consuming, and so people are inspired to do hunger strikes and not realize the toll. Um, Now, I was willing to risk my health in the short term, but not in the long term, which is why I had a
right.
deadline for my hunger strike. I have a 2-year-old baby,
Yeah.
and I am not going to give Zionists my life, right? But I wanted to do it as a tool in order to shame White House and State Department staff into seeing a personal choice based on conviction, where Palestinians don't have that choice, right? They don't have the choice to introduce calories or
Right.
vitamins or proteins into their diet, weeks in. And so, um, I did what I could, and I attempted to use it as a tool and a mechanism for accountability. By the poster I was carrying had a countdown that says you still have X amount of days
Right.
to do the right thing. You still have X amount of days to do the right thing. And the specific campaign I was focusing on was forced starvation. Because people were just acting like people in
Right.
Gaza were just starving. No, no, no. They're being forcibly starved by US policies that block food and humanitarian support
Right.
from going into Gaza. And so that was it was tied to a goal and a timeline that was doable. I don't know where I would have ended up if I didn't introduce vitamins on the 19th day, but
Right.
it ended up abruptly ending my hunger strike, and I was hospitalized for 5 days and came out, and it just never felt the same to get back into it.
Absolutely. And I did see many of those really powerful images on your social media pages about, just raising awareness on the toll this actually takes, the realities of, the realities that we don't really see. We don't really comprehend when someone says, you have people who are starving. The visualization is often really hard until you actually see someone bring it in front of your face or even embark on. Atifa, do you also want to kind of expand on how that experience was for you?
Yes, so for me, it wasn't a full-on hunger strike. It was a modified liquid calorie restricted fast. And just knowing my own physical limitations and some health issues, I decided to do a modified version. And originally, my goal was 40 days, just for various reasons and spiritual significance and all that. And one of the reasons for me was a letter that Blinken and Lloyd Austin, had sent to Israel, to Netanyahu, saying that if he doesn't let humanitarian aid in, that there are some consequences. And the deadline came and went, and there were no consequences, and there was no accountability. So I felt like, own small
Right.
way, maybe I can, bring some attention to this. And for me, I mean, definitely, as much as I think about, the plight of the Palestinians and the children and the starvation, the forced starvation, which is a war crime, just feeling that constant hunger every day was just on another level. And for me, I actually did not make it to day 40 because from the very beginning, I said that if it's going to affect my daily activism and it's going to reduce the amount that I'm out there on the streets, that I was going to stop it, which I ended up doing on day 30. I do have to say that it
Right.
is a good way to bring attention to this issue, especially if you're out in the workplace. I think it's a good conversation starter. But yeah, so for
Absolutely.
me, I stopped at day 30.
And you mentioned the whole theme of continuing your activism. One of the viral videos that we saw come out of your activism in specific was the disruptions that you did. Several of them, obviously, but one of them that really stood out to me specifically was the one with the Secretary of State Blinken's last speech in the Biden administration. That video was very powerful. Definitely went viral, and it was seen as really a testament to what the heights that activism can achieve directly at the heart of the U.S. government itself. Can you also speak to us about the different forms of disruptions that your team did? Which one stood out to you guys the most?
Okay, so the Antony Blinken disruption was almost exactly a month ago. I will say that that still, for me personally, stands out. I mean, disrupting, to be honest, can be very scary and nerve-wracking, and it's definitely unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. You
Right.
don't know if you're going to be arrested, if you're going to be tackled, if you're going to be, yelled at or whatever. And I remember that day just walking up with Hazami towards the Atlantic Council, and I was shaking. My heart was racing. My mouth was dry. My throat was dry. And I specifically remember just really thinking about Palestinian mothers as I was walking up. Sorry. And I was just like, nothing that I can ever risk is going to be anything worse than what we've already risked and lost. So Um, when the time came, I was nervous leading all the way up to it. I was sitting. But the second I stood up, I don't know what happened. It wasn't even me. I feel like it was all of us, all of our grief and anger. And it just came out, and he was standing right there. And I got to tell him what was on all of our minds. And yeah, so for me, that stands out.
Absolutely, and it was definitely a very powerful scene. It's very emotional as well for those who for so long have witnessed all of this, witnessed all of the Israeli aggression against Palestinians on their phone screens, and to see someone stand up there and really speak truth to power was a very powerful sight. So kudos to your team for that. Summer, I also wanted to ask you. I know your whole team, including many others who have joined you as well, have time and time again walked the halls of Congress and appealed to the humanity of government officials, senators, representatives, to kind of represent their constituents, which would include yourselves and so many others who have been protesting what's been happening in Palestine for so long. Has there ever been a case where through these appeals and through these conversations that you've tried to have, assuming they weren't shut down, obviously, there has been a case where a government official has listened to your appeals or has even shown respect for the fact that their constituents do have these views and demands?
Um, well, I would say that I would think that I would have liked to have an effect on some of these people, but to be honest with you, I don't recall, for the majority, anyone that I have confronted has been vile in the way they spoke to me. And I think part of that had to do with me being a hijabi too, because other people that I
Right.
had been out with um, were spoken to if they were asked a question. They asked senators or congressmen questions, and they would answer them. A lot of times I would have this, walk with the same people, and they won't even talk to me. I'd
Right.
like to think that that's not the case, but unfortunately, there's a lot of racism when it comes to our senators and congressmen. Um, I've spoken to Tim Kaine personally before. We've had a meeting, and he promised to. I told him my thoughts that I don't believe anything he said. He hadn't at that time. It was back maybe a month or so after the genocide started, and I had asked him why he hadn't called for a ceasefire, and that no matter what he believes or has happened, there should be no reason for civilians to be slaughtered in this manner and or at any
Right.
manner. And he had promised that, for me to look at his actions and not maybe what he has done in the past. And I told him, okay, I will give him that chance. Nothing was ever done. I think at one point he did call for a ceasefire, but um, it took him a while to do that. And when it came to votes for money going to Israel, he was part of the votes going for that. There were many that, were voting uh, when they would say, well, we want to vote for money to go at least for the Iron Dome. And I would tell them there would be no reason to send money for the Iron Dome if there was no occupation. There would be no reason
Right.
for the Palestinians to have to defend themselves if there was no occupation. So a lot of their wording was twisted. Um, some of them tried to seem like they cared, but when their actions came, it proved that they were not for the Palestinians. A lot of them would tell me, and mostly Republicans were very outspoken when they would say, well, it's not that we are not standing with Israel, but we don't want our money funding anything outside of the United States. And
Right.
I just, I don't believe there were many, that have done enough for the Palestinians. There were some that changed their views, said, had come out, spoken that this is a genocide, or that we need to quit sending money to Israel, quit sending weapons, and that's great,
Right.
but more needs to be done. A lot of them don't even admit that there's an occupation, and when you are not seen as human beings, then they don't think you have any rights. I was also hit in Congress by one of the congressmen, and it was
Oh, wow.
videoed. Nothing happened to him. Of course, it was, he had full immunity of laying his hands on me. And it's just, it's an awful thing that you see when you walk into these halls, that you pay your taxes, you try to speak to these people like they're human beings, and want them to see you as a human, and it's not happening.
One point that you made that I also want to kind of speak about, you mentioned how some of the Republican representatives, one thing that they stand for is, it's not that we don't support Israel, but it's just we don't like the idea of our taxpayer money going to fund foreign wars. One thing that I've actually seen, and I'd like your thoughts on as well, is there is this kind of hypocrisy when it comes to what specific wars they are about funding. For example, you'll have a lot of Republicans super against the idea that we're sending so much money to Ukraine, but when it comes to Israel, it's almost as if they don't have that same level of concern. Have you found that to be true, or else?
Yeah, I see that as part of the problem too. For Ukraine, they didn't want to send money, but they also didn't think that what uh, Russia was doing was fair, and that Ukrainians had a right to defend themselves. With Israel, they want to keep supplying money. This administration, it's like it doesn't matter how much, as long as Israel's asking, we'll just keep supplying, and it's no problem. And like I said, they don't admit to or acknowledge the fact that there's an occupation, and that it has been going on for over 76 years. And so when they say Ukraine has a right to defend itself, but they don't think that Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, it's very hypocritical.
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of to move forward to one of the most contentious topics when it comes to activism in relation to Palestine. Hazami, I'd like your thoughts on this. One common way that we see activists often get immediately shut down with the work they're doing, in specific about Palestine, even having their careers destroyed or going on lists and all of that, is when they are labeled as Hamas supporters or resistance supporters. And that kind of language is very commonly used to kind of shut down the legitimacy of what they're doing and immediately delegitimize them. How has your team kind of gone about this specific conversation, and what, kinds of pushback, if any, have you received on this specific topic?
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think you see time and time again words and labels that are used to try to not only discredit people, but also try to frame you in a certain light that is dangerous to uh, U.S. or to American interests domestically. And that is why they try to do things like calling people, for example, Hamas supporters or terror enablers, or so on and so forth. And you're seeing this with, for example, the pushback on nonprofit organizations and attempts to sue people for incitement. The hypocrisy here is something that we
Right.
continue to highlight. What we have found with our protesting is that what is being exposed is the vile inhumanity of Zionism and those that support it here in
Right.
the United States. we respond with, looking at the example of Martin Luther King and looking at the example of the civil rights movement in this country, where you had sit-ins at counters in restaurants, and you had these images of, white people throwing literally food and trash at people that were sitting at the counters that were pushing through the segregation bans. And they just sat there poised, and they sat there, taking it as a way to show the inhumanity and the vile nature of those that are literally saying you cannot have equal rights because of the color of your skin. And we just let that sink in,
Right.
right? You have people that are angry and vile and upset and are using violence in order to try to get people to stand down from their God-given
Right.
rights, right? And that is what we're seeing with Zionism and Zionists right now. So we don't fall into that, and we actually use the example of the civil rights when I kind of put together the initial infrastructure of kind of our group norms and our group values. We don't have a formal group. We are a grassroots network,
Right.
and that's by design. But when I put together kind of the community guidelines, it was very much looking at the example of how can we embody the values that we are speaking to, which means when we're insulted, we don't insult back because that is
Right.
not our values. When we are spit on, we don't spit back because that is not our values. And the best way to be an advocate and to show the humanity of Palestinians is to simply be a decent human being that
Right.
we all are, right? Zionists are compelled to violence because their entire existence in Palestine and here is tied into bullying and aggression and domineering and coercion and lying and manipulating. And we don't have to do that because truth
Right.
is on our side, and history will show you that. And so we don't play into it. I know a lot of groups struggle with this. I know that, for example, we show up unmasked. We're in front of the Israeli embassy looking straight at the security systems that we know are not only AI systems that scan our faces and know everything about our identity, but we drive our cars there. Habibi, dox me.
Right.
I am proud. And I will be proud in the future to say I stood on the right side of history and stepped into my values as a human rights activist and a social justice person and as a human, a good, decent human. Dox me. And until we get to a place where we allow ourselves to not allow fear to overcome, then we're going to constantly be secondary, and we're going to constantly live in a fear environment, which is exactly what the Zionists want. It's exactly what the administrations want. They want us to be afraid. What am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? I think that is where I think that we've been able to inspire more and more and more people that had a passion and a fire and a sense of urge to do
Right.
something, but didn't feel like they could, or didn't feel like they had a support environment or an ecosystem that enabled them. We became that, which is why our movement grew from being me with a one person that I convinced to join me, Tamara, to meeting people like Atefeh and Sumer, and meeting tons of people on social media, and growing our movement to, we have upwards of 1,900 plus people in our
Wow.
ecosystem, and we have collectively spent over 300,000 hours advocating for Palestine, both here, in person and online. And I think that in and of itself speaks volumes to how much trapped energy and potential we have as a community that we simply created
Right.
a release valve for. And we did that by being unapologetic and showing up with kindness, with love, with grace, not to be confused. Like, yes, we did yell at Blinken. Absolutely. That does not mean that we're
Right.
bad people, right? People have anger, and rage is a very big part of grieving. We were never violent. We were never, aggressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point you bring up, and it leads me to my next question. Atefeh, I think I'm going to address this to you, but one common kind of discussion that has happened throughout history, you mentioned Hazami, Martin Luther King Jr. We also had the other side, which was Malcolm X, and a lot of people kind of create a little bit of a difference in approach that these two leaders had when it came to social change. You mentioned peaceful, kind of, the nonviolence route. February 11th, which just passed, was also the anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela, who was also a leader who stood against apartheid and is an inspiration for many of us. And he also got to a point where he said sometimes nonviolence just does not work. So my question is, where is there a line to be drawn between violent, nonviolence versus, direct actions that we have seen from groups like Palestine Action when it comes to, targeting Elbit systems as an example? What are your thoughts on the balance between the two and which of the two can be deemed as more effective, if you will?
So for me, I don't think there's no way to know what method or what tactic is going to be more effective. Like I wish we knew, but we
Right.
just don't. And even for my own personal activism, I get the question, is what you're doing or your methods, is that even making a difference? I've gotten these questions in person and
Right.
a lot online. All I know is, and I can only speak for myself, like my faith teaches me to stand up and speak out against injustice and oppression. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to overthink
Right.
it too much, Otherwise, if you overthink and overanalyze and keep asking yourself, am I doing the right thing? What's the alternative? It's
Right.
to do nothing, you know? Or you think about it so much that it, freezes you or it paralyzes you. So my goal is to show up in my own way, even if it's imperfectly, then not
Right.
show up at all.
Absolutely. And kind of speaking about, Hazami, you mentioned the whole idea of getting doxxed or facing the consequences of the activism you have done. Summer, can you also touch on what kinds of pushback or consequences your team or members on your team have faced for the activism you have done?
Um, I mean, just being in front of Lincoln's or the embassy for 6 months, we had several articles written about us, and several things that were made up along the lines about us that, you know, eh, that weren't even true, that were trying to portray us as violent people
Right.
when we were never violent. Um, we stood in front of Lincoln's home. It was a 24/7 encampment, and I were to think that if any one of us were ever violent, Secret Service would not have allowed it. We were never violent. We did have rage,
Right.
like Hazemi mentioned, and that's part of seeing all the atrocities and that we've seen. Whether we are Palestinian or non-Palestinian, just pro-Palestinian. I think it is the fact that you're a human being, and you can't take looking at the things that we'd seen would lead us to have this rage. But we were portrayed at times as violent and as doing things that we didn't do. But we pushed through it and knew that, like they've said, truth was on our side. We had to keep doing what we were doing. And as Atfa mentioned, I have the same beliefs that my faith tells me, that if you are not able to, you know, physically do something, that you need to speak out about it. And so I had never even before had met Hazami, I had never even known that we could do
Right.
any of these things that we did, or be in Congress and speak out. I'd known Atfa for over 20 years, and when October happened, I had seen her go to Congress, and I said, "Oh my goodness, like, what are you doing? Like, I need to have an outlet to express my feelings too.
Right.
Like, tell me where you're going." Which then I realized I could start going to Congress. I could start going into the Senate buildings. Um, and it really allowed this valve, like Hazemi mentioned, to be released because there was a lot of pent up anger just watching what our people had been going through. So people can say what they want to say, they can make up lies, and it really does not matter. I think though, as long as we know ourselves what we are doing, um, and to me, what my faith knows and what God knows that we are doing, I have no problem. Anyone else can speak however they please
Absolutely.
about
And
me.
I think that's a very powerful sentiment as well. And to kind of wrap up the conversation, one thing I'd like to know, and I think either any of you can kind of chime in about this. What do you see your group kind of doing moving forward? Obviously, we have a new administration, a new president in office. Do you think that will, by any chance, limit any of the activism that you're doing, especially the ones that involve physically going into, Congress, speaking to government officials, being on the scene? And how do you foresee or predict your group will kind of grow and increase its activism in the coming months and even years?
And I could say that I don't think activism changes based on administration. Palestine-Israel policy is very, very the same across the board, regardless of administration. And actually, we've seen some of the biggest land grabs of Palestinian land has been under Democratic administrations. We've seen under the Obama administration horrendous land grabs and also just an absolute discard for
Right.
Palestinian human life. And human rights, and then similarly under Biden, I think it's extremely important to say that we, piggybacking on some of what Summer was said, we experienced a lot of hostility from Democrats. We actually, Atwa and I physically got assaulted from someone who considered themselves a liberal, physically assaulted by someone who considered themselves liberal progressive. And we, again, stood in front of polling sites, and the people that called the police on us, that lied about us, that physically, intimidated us or attempted to, we're all wearing shirts that said proud Democrat, right? It wasn't the Republican Party. So I think we need to deconstruct in our own minds that there's these like good or
Right.
bad guys on Palestine. The entire US policy is the same. But I think what changes is that we have to understand it's kind of like the chicken or an egg. Does the culture create the policy, or does the policy create the culture? And I think we are living in a world where the one thing I have learned over the last 60 months doing straight advocacy is that there's so much misinformation and lack of understanding. We have police officers come up to us and ask us,
Oh,
who is
wow.
Blinken? Police officers in
That's
Washington,
concerning.
D.C.,
Yeah.
that do not know who Blinken is. But, it is concerning, but at the same time, I'll ask you, Sana, like, who is the department, who is the, under Biden administration or whomever, who is the Secretary of Energy? Who is the Secretary of Interior? So unless causes impact
Right.
people, they don't know, right? We don't know. So we have a duty to educate, and we have a duty to empower and inspire your average person to start giving a damn. And that is where you're going to start to deconstruct this deep support of Israel that's happening in churches, in schools, in synagogues. I mean, synagogues are literally hosting events about selling Palestinian land. 501c3 organizations, nonprofits in this country are literally earning money, tax deductible charitable money, to fund illegal settlement activity. And so until we start to understand that this requires a benevolent army of so many of us that figure out what our niche is and start to unpack that, no party is going to save us. No political leader is going to save us. We need to start becoming informed, and it expand that network, and then they then start to put pressure on local politics, which then impacts state politics, which impacts national politics and international policies. And that's where I think just, change requires your average person to start doing something. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is to inspire a movement for change that expands the pool of who considers themselves an
Absolutely. That was
activist.
well, thank you for that. And speaking about your point on selling land in Israel, that's actually something that didn't just happen in the US, it also happened in Toronto. When I was there for a while, it was actually something happening in synagogues where in Toronto you were having events being held where land was being sold in the West Bank to people who were coming in. Like, you would set an appointment, go there, and you were able to buy land in the West Bank. And that's unfortunately something that we're seeing now. So this happened over a year ago, and now we're seeing all the rhetoric coming out about, we're going to clear out Gaza, and the whole idea of, oh, Gaza, Trump saying it's a, great location, great place. We're going to build there. We're going to kind of, so it's really true what you're saying about, how this should really start with education, because many were also unaware that this was happening. And that was actually something TMJ covered, but now we're kind of seeing the real consequences of what that's going to look like.
Well, I'm just going to say, for anyone that has pretty much been silent so far, or been afraid, or didn't know what to do, I would just encourage them to step out of the fear and step into their truth and their own power, according to their own beliefs and values. Anything you have that you hold dear and you're afraid to lose, whether it's your job or your reputation, or your freedom, your life, that can happen for a variety of reasons. So, and in the blink of an eye. So you might as well do the right thing. And nothing is worth your complicity that comes with your silence. So I would just like to encourage people to do what they can. It's kind of like it's never too late. I know it's 16 months later, but we're here and we're waiting
Thank
for
you
you.
so much, Atefeh, Hazami, and Sumer, for first of all giving us your time, and all the best with your activism. And we hope to see the amazing work that you continue to do.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
If you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. TMJ News is a grassroots independent media, and you can find ways to support us in the caption below. Thank you for joining us in this conversation today.